I think what matters when we talk about naval power is the dynamic aspect, meaning where do you want to apply naval power and in which context? Will China attempt to take Taiwan by force? And if yes, how will the two navies be deployed? Well, clearly, in a military sense, today for China, the United States is the number one military power. It is, in their jargon, the principal hegemon. And China wants to change this particular equation. This does not mean that the United States will always prevail in any military engagement, because this is what the war in Ukraine has shown. The Russia-Ukraine war, that today asymmetry can be addressed in very innovative ways, and that's what technology has done.
Hello and a very warm welcome. You're watching Hindustan Times. China is increasing its naval power and sending signals to Washington and its allies. To understand more, we have Commodore C Uday Bhaskar joining us. So thank you so much for taking out the time to speak with us. Mr. Bhaskar essentially is a retired Indian Navy officer and a strategic affairs analyst, currently serving as director of the Society for Policy Studies in New Delhi. China is quickly closing the gaps between their naval force and America's. When those gaps do finally close, what kind of ramifications could this have on the perception of America's global power?
This perception that the Chinese Navy is catching up with the US Navy needs to be examined a little carefully. Because if you look at it only in terms of numbers, that is the number of major platforms. Any Navy has major platforms, which are both the surface ships and the submarines. They also have a component of naval aviation. So one metric is to look at the number of ships and say that currently China has as many as 370 major platforms, plus minus a few. The last estimate was 2024. They're estimated to have 370 major platforms. And in comparison, the United States is below 300. It's about 292, if I remember right. So that seems to suggest that the Chinese Navy today is the largest by way of numbers, which is factually correct. But this does not mean or does not translate into the inference that the Chinese Navy is today the most powerful Navy in the world. That is misleading, factually incorrect, because the Navy has to be assessed more in terms of its what is called as the Composite Combat Power, CCP. And if you use that as the metric, the United States is way ahead of the Chinese Navy, which, as you know, is referred to as the PLA Navy plan, the People's Liberation Army Navy plan. So I think that's the first observation that we need to bring to the table, that China is a distant second. Some even say it's third in terms of the ranking of global navies, because it does have numbers. It has a very impressive ship design, warship design and warship building program. If I remember right, 2017 to 2022, 5 years, the PLA Navy inducted more ships, major ships, than 5 countries put together. And these 5 countries are United Kingdom, France, India, Japan, and one more country. So basically, the pace at which they're inducting platforms is very impressive. But the United States still remains the most powerful Navy in terms of the composite combat power. And China is catching up, but it's not yet there.
And how crucial is the Indo-Pacific region for naval warfare?
It is. The Indo-Pacific is a very important maritime theater. But if you look at the Indian Ocean from the Straits of Hormuz, from the Suez Canal, which connects to the Indian Ocean, the oil-rich Persian Gulf, and all the way through the Indian Ocean to the Malacca Straits, which will then enable ships to enter the Pacific, and all the way around East Asia, right up to Japan, That is roughly the grid for the Indo-Pacific region. And in today's geopolitical context, one could fairly say that, or make a reasonable kind of case to say that it is the most important maritime theater in the world for a variety of reasons: geopolitics, geoeconomics, and the kind of trade and energy dependency that this particular Indo-Pacific from Hormuz to Malaccas represents. So, given all these considerations, yes, it is important. But circling back to this question of the US Navy and the Chinese Navy, I think what matters when we talk about naval power is the dynamic aspect, meaning where do you want to apply naval power and in which context? Now, the standard reference in the Indo Pacific in relation to these two countries, United States and China, is about Taiwan. Will China attempt to take Taiwan by force? And if yes, how will the two navies be deployed? How important would they be? I think that is in many ways a question that professionals have been grappling with for a long time. And in that context, because I think that's an important point to bear in mind, the context and the kinetic or the temporal dimension. What exactly is the political objective of using naval power? From the Chinese side, it is very clear they want the reunification of Taiwan. You may recall that President Xi Jinping is believed to have indicated that 2027 is the year by which the unification would be complete and Taiwan returns to the motherland, quote unquote. But the United States has sent a very strong signal that, irrespective of who's in the White House, that they do not support the use of force. They do not recognize Taiwan as a separate country. So it's a very interesting kind of a gray situation in terms of the status of Taiwan and the degree to which military force will be brought to bear. But there's no doubt that in the event the balloon goes up and China attempts to use military force to regain, as they say, Taiwan, Taiwan, on the other hand, is determined to defend its own independence. In the last month, we've had a number of exercises, last 2 months, I would say, both between the Chinese military showing muscle power and the Taiwanese also engaging in their annual defense exercises. So the military anxiety is always there. And it's in that dynamic or kinetic context that naval power would become very, very relevant.
So, what do you think China's larger goals are, and who do you think is their biggest threat at this point?
Well, clearly, in a military sense, today for China, the United States is the number one military power. It is, in their jargon, the principal hegemon. And China wants to change this particular equation. And again, in the strategic jargon, we talk about the status quo power, which is the United States currently militarily, particularly in the maritime naval dimension. And China is the revisionist power. China is aspiring to catch up with the United States in a composite sense, not just in terms of naval power. We talk about composite combat power as far as any navy is concerned, but there is also a comprehensive military index, which is all aspects of military power, which is, to put it in a more rudimentary manner, we are talking about the comprehensive military power that would bring to bear or include the army, the navy, the air force, air power, space power, underwater. And in today's context, we also have to look at the equivalent of cyber and spectrum to the extent that they are relevant, as also whatever new technologies like AI, artificial intelligence, would do to comprehensive military power for any nation. So on that grid, the United States still remains way ahead of China, but China is catching up. And, but I do want to make this point, it's sometimes easy to arrive at perhaps wrong conclusions or invalid conclusions when we try and do just a quantitative analysis of military power or, for that matter, naval power, and say you have arrived at a number and say the United States is currently at 94 on a scale of 100 and China is only at 62. I'm just giving you ballpark figures. This does not mean that the United States will always prevail in any military engagement, because this is what the war in Ukraine has shown, the Russia-Ukraine war, that today asymmetry can be addressed in very innovative ways. And that's what technology has done. But the drone is a good example. A drone is a very inexpensive option. More often than not, the unmanned armed drone can bring about a certain tactical outcome which can stun or surprise the larger military or the more powerful military, as was the case with the Russian military. I mean, after all, they lost a ship, a major warship, if you remember the Russia-Ukraine war. And therefore, when we talk about the United States, China, much will depend on the context, much will depend on the political and military competence in terms of using military power, and the ability of either side to bear pain. What are the losses they are willing to take for the given objective? Now, in China's case, they have said, come what may, we will take Taiwan. I mean, there have been instances when they have made some very rash kind of observations, or they've tried to signal to the United States and the rest of the world that we will go to any length to take back Taiwan. How this is going to play out in a real-time context, that would be, I think, the ultimate litmus test. And it's often said in relation to China that China has numbers. China is a communist country. It has a very authoritarian regime. President Xi Jinping is all-powerful. He's recently, by the way, sacked his naval chief once more. A number of senior generals and military officials and defense ministers have been removed because of turbulence within China. So all of this may impact China in a real-time combat situation. And most importantly, unlike the United States, which has a lot of combat experience, sometimes not so flattering as we saw in Afghanistan, the Chinese military has very little actual combat experience. Their last major engagement was in Vietnam. We are talking about the late 70s. After that, they really haven't had. Galwan doesn't count because Galwan was more a scuffle with India. Yes, they are doing multiplexing in the South China Sea. They use their Coast Guard, they use their civilian militia to bump and create a lot of turbulence within the South China Sea. But there's been no serious exchange of ordnance. So in that sense, this is one more factor that when we talk about the combat efficiency, or rather efficacy of the Chinese military, lack of experience also has to be factored in when you compare the entire Chinese system with that of the United States.
All right, Mr. Bhaskar, thank you so much for joining us and providing us with all of that insight.